He stood in the Forum of Rome, and he read his own name on a list of the dead. He had done nothing wrong. He had no enemies that he knew of, but his name was there in black ink, posted for the whole city to see. And in that moment, he understood something terrible. "Wretched man that I am," he said, "my Alban villa is hunting me down." He had not been killed for his politics. He had not been killed for his beliefs. He was killed because another man wanted his vacation house. This is not fiction. This happened in Rome in the year 82 before Christ, and it happened to thousands of people in a matter of weeks. Husbands, fathers, senators, old men who had never held a sword. The killing was legal. The killing was organized. The killing was even paid for by the government itself. And the man who ordered it called it something else entirely. He called it justice. Welcome to Bone and Crown. Today we are going back 2,100 years to the night Rome turned on itself. And by the end of this story, you will understand something that should disturb you. This was not the act of a madman. This was a system, built carefully, used efficiently, and historians still argue about whether anything like it has ever truly ended. To understand how this happened, you need to understand Rome before the killing began. By the year 100 before Christ, Rome was the most powerful city on earth. It had conquered Carthage. It had conquered Greece. It controlled the entire Mediterranean coastline. But inside the city walls, something dangerous was growing. Rome was a republic. This meant, in theory, that no single man could rule alone. Power was shared between the Senate, the wealthy aristocrats, and the people's assemblies, where ordinary citizens could vote. For centuries, this balance held, but there was one rule that mattered more than any law. A rule that was never written down, because everyone simply understood it. No army was allowed inside the city of Rome. Soldiers could conquer the world, but the moment they crossed an invisible boundary called the Pomerium, the sacred line around the city, they had to lay down their weapons. Even the most powerful general in Rome was, inside those walls, just a citizen. This rule had protected Rome from itself for over 400 years. It meant that political arguments stayed arguments. Disagreements were settled with words, with votes, with speeches in the Senate, not with blood. But by 100 before Christ, Rome's armies had changed. Soldiers were no longer just citizens who served briefly and returned to their farms. They were now professional fighters, loyal not to Rome itself, but to whichever general paid them and led them to victory. This single change, soldiers loyal to a man instead of a nation, would eventually destroy the Republic. And two men would prove exactly how dangerous that change could be. Their names were Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Gaius Marius was already a legend by the time this story begins. He had saved Rome from invasion. He was elected consul, the highest office in Rome. An unprecedented 7 times. He came from nothing. A farming family, far from the aristocracy. And he never forgot that the noble families of Rome looked down on him for it. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was different. Sulla came from an old aristocratic family that had fallen into poverty. He was charming, intelligent, and ruthlessly ambitious. For years, Sulla served under Marius as a younger officer. He was loyal, he was effective, and Marius grew to resent him. Because Sulla kept succeeding, and every success Sulla achieved felt to Marius like a success stolen from him. The breaking point came during the social war. a brutal conflict where Rome's own Italian allies rebelled, demanding the citizenship they had been promised for generations. Both Marius and Sulla fought in this war, but it was Sulla who emerged as the new hero of Rome. Marius, aging and increasingly bitter, watched his former subordinate eclipse him completely. In 88 before Christ, the Senate awarded Sulla command of Rome's most prestigious military campaign, the war against King Mithridates of Pontus, who had just massacred 80,000 Roman citizens in Asia Minor. It should have been the height of Sulla's career, but Marius wanted that command for himself. So Marius made an alliance with a radical tribune named Sulpicius. Together they pushed a law through the popular assembly. The law stripped Sulla of his command and handed it to Marius instead. Sulla was consul of Rome. He held legal command of the army, and now, through political maneuvering, an old rival had taken it from him. What Sulla did next had never happened in the history of Rome. He marched his army into the city itself. 6 legions, Roman soldiers armed for war, crossing the sacred boundary that no army had ever crossed. The citizens of Rome watched in horror as their own army marched through their own streets. Marius and Sulpicius tried to organize resistance. They had no real army to fight with, only what they could gather in panic, in the streets, with no time to prepare. It was hopeless. Sulla's veterans crushed any resistance within hours. Sulpicius was captured and executed. Marius, the 6-time consul, the savior of Rome, fled the city as a fugitive. He hid in the marshes near the coast. Soldiers hunting him nearly found him buried in mud up to his neck. He escaped to North Africa, where he lived in exile, watching the ruins of an old fortress, reportedly telling visitors, "Go tell them you saw Marius, a fugitive, sitting among the ruins of Carthage." Sulla, now in full control of Rome, did something that revealed his character. He did not slaughter his enemies, not yet. He declared Marius and his allies public enemies of the state, condemned to death if they returned. And then he left. He had a war to fight against Mithridates, and he intended to fight it. This decision would prove to be a catastrophic mistake, because the moment Sulla's army left Italy, his enemies began to recover. And in his absence, a different kind of terror would descend on Rome. With Sulla gone, the political balance in Rome shattered completely. A consul named Cinna, sympathetic to Marius's cause, seized power. And in 87 before Christ, Marius himself returned from exile. He came back with an army of his own, desperate men, freed slaves, anyone willing to fight. Rome had no real defense against him. The city fell once again, this time to Marius and Cinna's combined forces. What happened next is remembered by historians as one of the darkest periods in Roman history. Marius, now 70 years old, embittered by exile, betrayal, and humiliation, unleashed a wave of killing against anyone connected to Sulla. There were no formal lists yet. That horror was still to come. Instead, Marius simply ordered the deaths of his enemies, one by one, often based on nothing more than a grudge or a rumor. According to ancient sources, Marius walked through the streets of Rome with his personal guard, and when he passed someone he recognized as an enemy, even simply someone who failed to greet him with proper respect, he would gesture, and his guards would kill that person on the spot. Senators were dragged from their homes. Former consuls were executed without trial. Heads were displayed on spears in the Forum, a horrifying preview of what would come later. Marius died just weeks after seizing power. Old, exhausted, possibly from illness brought on by years of stress and excess. But his ally Cinna continued the purge for years afterward. Rome had now seen twice that political defeat meant death. The unwritten rules of the Republic, the ones that had protected Rome for centuries, were already broken. And far away in Greece and Asia Minor, Sulla was watching, fighting Mithridates, winning battle after battle, and waiting. Because Sulla knew that eventually he would have to come home. And when he did, he intended to make sure that what happened to him would never be forgotten by anyone who survived it. By 83 before Christ, Sulla had defeated Mithridates and secured a peace treaty. He loaded his battle-hardened legions onto ships and sailed back to Italy. These were not the same soldiers who had marched on Rome 5 years earlier. These men had spent years fighting in the East. They were veterans, loyal entirely to Sulla, hungry for the rewards he had promised them. Sulla landed at Brundisium in southern Italy, and from that moment, the Second Civil War began. For nearly 2 years, Italy became a battlefield. Sulla's forces fought their way north, city by city, toward Rome. Other commanders joined his cause, among them a young, ambitious nobleman named Gnaeus Pompeius, who would later be known to history as Pompey the Great. The Marian faction, desperate, made a fatal alliance. They called upon the Samnites, Rome's oldest and most hated enemies, a people Rome had fought and brutally suppressed for over a century. The Samnites agreed, not out of loyalty to Marius's cause, but because they saw a chance to finally destroy the city that had crushed them for generations. A massive army of Samnites and Lucanians, as many as 70,000 men, marched toward Rome itself. Their goal was not subtle. According to ancient historians, their general, Pontius Telesinus, declared that Rome itself needed to be destroyed, its wolf den torn down forever, for Italy to ever truly be free. On the 1st of November, 82 before Christ, this massive army reached the gates of Rome. Sulla's forces intercepted them just outside the city walls at a place called the Colline Gate. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles in Roman history. The fighting raged for an entire day and into the night. Sulla's own left wing nearly collapsed completely. For a moment, it seemed Rome itself might fall to a foreign army for the first time since the Gauls, centuries earlier. But on the right flank, a young commander named Marcus Crassus achieved a decisive breakthrough. By the end of the battle, an estimated 50,000 men lay dead on the field. Rome had survived, but the cost, and what came next, would prove far darker than the battle itself. After the battle, Sulla's soldiers rounded up thousands of survivors. Many were Samnites, Rome's ancient enemy. Others were simply soldiers who had fought for the losing side. Historical accounts vary on the exact number. Some say 6,000, others say closer to 8,000 prisoners were brought into the city and held in a place called the Villa Publica, a public building near the Campus Martius. At the very same time, Sulla called the surviving members of the Senate, what remained of Rome's governing body after years of civil war, to a meeting at the nearby temple of Bellona. Imagine being a senator in that room. You have survived years of civil war. You have watched friends and family members die on both sides of this conflict, and now the victorious general has summoned you to hear his terms for the future of Rome. As Sulla began to speak, a sound reached the temple from outside. Screaming. Not the screaming of battle, the screaming of organized, methodical execution. Sulla had ordered his soldiers to begin killing the prisoners at the Villa Publica. At the exact same moment, he was addressing the Senate. The senators, understandably terrified, asked what was happening. And Sulla's response has been recorded by multiple ancient historians, almost word for word. He told them to pay no attention. He said it was nothing more than the sound of some criminals receiving their just punishment. Think about what this moment actually was. It was not a battlefield. The fighting was already over. These were unarmed prisoners, and Sulla was using their deaths, their screams, audible to the most powerful men in Rome, as a message that said, I now control life and death in this city, and I will decide what justice means. This was not yet the proscriptions. That horror was still days away. But the Villa Publica massacre was the opening statement. It told every senator in that room exactly what kind of man now ruled Rome. Just 2 days after the Villa Publica massacre, Sulla took the next step. He addressed the Senate again. And according to the ancient historian Plutarch, a young senator named Gaius Metellus stood up and asked Sulla a simple, desperate question. He said, "We are not asking you to spare those you have already decided to punish. We are asking you to end the uncertainty for everyone else. Tell us, who will you spare?" And Sulla's answer became one of the most chilling statements in Roman history. He said he did not yet know. Metellus pressed him, "Then tell us who you intend to destroy." And Sulla agreed. He would make a list. The first list was posted in the forum. 80 names, 80 of Sulla's most prominent political enemies, condemned to death, by name, in writing, for the entire city to read. People murmured at the illegality of it. There had been no trials, no formal charges, just a list. And as if to answer their objections, 2 days later, Sulla posted a second list, 220 more names. The next day, a third list, just as many. Eventually, from the speaker's platform in the forum, Sulla addressed the people of Rome directly. He told them that he had now proscribed everyone he could remember, and anyone he had forgotten would simply be added to a future list. Let that sink in for a moment. The dictator of Rome stood before his own citizens and casually admitted that his death lists were incomplete, not because he lacked the will to kill more, but because he had simply lost count. This is what made the proscriptions so uniquely terrifying. It was not the violence of a single furious night. It was the threat of violence that could return again and again indefinitely. Because no one, not even Sulla himself, knew exactly when it would stop. Like and subscribe. Tono calido, no invasivo. Before we continue into the darkest part of this story, if you're learning English with this channel and finding these deep historical stories interesting, let me know in the comments. Tell me what surprised you the most about this so far. And if you'd like more stories like this, real history, told in detail, with the parts most documentaries skip, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep going. Okay, let's continue. Because what comes next is the part of this story that most people have never heard. The proscription lists were not just a death sentence. They were a carefully designed system. And every part of that system was built to make ordinary Roman citizens complicit in murder. Here is how it worked. If your name appeared on the list, you could be killed by anyone, anywhere, with complete legal immunity. Anyone who killed a proscribed man received a reward of 2 talents, an enormous sum of money, equivalent to years of a soldier's pay. This applied to everyone. A slave who killed his own master would not only go unpunished, he would be rewarded with money and his freedom. A son who killed his own father would be rewarded the same way. Think about what this did to Roman society. It did not simply allow murder. It incentivized betrayal at the most intimate levels of human relationship. Trusted household slaves began watching their masters differently. Sons looked at fathers with the terrible knowledge that loyalty no longer had any legal value, only proximity and opportunity. And it became worse. Anyone caught sheltering or helping a proscribed person faced the same fate as the condemned man himself: death, regardless of their own innocence. This meant that even a man's closest friends, the people who might have hidden him, fed him, helped him escape the city, now had every legal and financial incentive to instead turn him in or kill him themselves. The system was, in its own horrifying way, brilliant. Sulla did not need an army of soldiers to enforce the prescriptions. He needed only greed, fear, and the collapse of trust between Roman citizens, and Rome provided all three in abundance. Bounty hunters roamed the city and the countryside, hunting proscribed men for profit. Roman historians describe gangs of these hunters as little more than professional killers, competing with each other to collect the reward money first. And the wealth being seized was not a side effect of the prescriptions. For many of Sulla's supporters, it was the entire point. A proscribed man's property was confiscated by the state and then sold, often at deeply discounted prices, to Sulla's allies and favorites. Men close to Sulla became extraordinarily wealthy in a matter of weeks, simply by acquiring the homes, farms, and fortunes of murdered Romans. Historians who have studied the financial records estimate that this redistribution of wealth was one of the largest in Roman history up to that point. Billions of sesterces changing hands, almost entirely from the murdered to the politically connected. This is the detail that modern audiences often miss about the prescriptions. It was not simply political revenge. It was, in large part, a coordinated transfer of wealth, disguised as justice, executed through legalized murder. Now let's talk about the people. Because history remembers Sulla, history remembers the numbers, but it rarely remembers the names of the men who actually died. One of the most famous victims was a man named Marcus Marius Gratidianus. He was the nephew of Gaius Marius, by blood, connected to Sulla's old enemy. But Gratidianus was not simply collateral damage of a family feud. He had been, just a few years earlier, one of the most beloved political figures in Rome. During a severe economic crisis, when counterfeit and unstable currency had thrown ordinary Romans into financial chaos, Gratidianus implemented currency reforms that stabilized the coinage and restored public confidence. The people of Rome loved him for it. Statues of Gratidianus were erected across the city, an extraordinary honor for a man who was not even a consul, simply a praetor who had solved a problem that affected every Roman family. But his connection to Marius made him a marked man the moment Sulla returned to power. What happened to Gratidianus is recorded by multiple ancient historians, with horrifying consistency in the central details. He was dragged through the streets of Rome to the tomb of a man named Lutatius Catulus, a Roman whom Marius had once driven to suicide. The location was deliberate. This was not simply an execution. It was designed as a ritual of revenge. The man given the task of killing Gratidianus was a young, ambitious Roman named Lucius Sergius Catilina, a name that would later become infamous in its own right, decades afterward, in a conspiracy against Cicero himself. According to the most detailed ancient accounts, Catalina did not simply kill Gratidianus. He broke his arms. He broke his legs. He gouged out his eyes while Gratidianus was still alive. One ancient historian described it with a chilling phrase, that Gratidianus's life was drained from him, quite literally, through each individual limb. Finally, Catalina cut off his head, and then, according to multiple sources, he carried that severed head through the streets of Rome in his own hands, all the way to where Sulla was holding court, presenting it to him while it was, in the words of one ancient account, still warm with blood. This was not an isolated act of cruelty. This was a demonstration, a message to every Roman citizen watching. This is what loyalty to Sulla now requires. This is what devotion looks like. But perhaps the most quietly devastating story from the prescriptions belongs not to a famous political figure, but to an ordinary, unnamed Roman citizen. According to the ancient historian Appian, a man, his name lost to history, walked into the forum one day, simply out of curiosity, to read the latest prescription list as it was posted. He had no political enemies. He held no public office. He had taken no side in the Civil War. He was, by every account, an innocent bystander to Rome's catastrophe. And as he read through the names on the list, he found his own. His exact words were recorded by Appian, and they have survived for over 2,000 years. He cried out, "Wretched man that I am, my Alban villa is hunting me down." He understood in that single horrifying instant exactly why he had been prescribed, not for politics, not for loyalty to Marius, not for any crime at all. Someone, perhaps someone he had never even met, simply wanted his vacation property in the hills outside Rome and had paid to have his name added to the list. He did not even have time to process the horror of his own death sentence. According to Appian, a hired killer recognized him from the description on the list and murdered him on the spot within moments of his own discovery, right there in the forum, in broad daylight, surrounded by other citizens who did nothing because doing anything to help him would have meant their own death. This story, more than almost any other from the prescriptions, reveals the true horror of the system Sulla created. It was not justice. It was not even truly political revenge in most cases. It was simply an opportunity for greed, for old grudges, for the casual acquisition of another man's life and property with the full protection of the law. Roman historians of the time recorded a bitter saying that, spread through the city during this period, people would say of the dead, "His fine home was the death of one man, his gardens the death of another, his private baths the death of a third." Because the hunters, more often than not, were not pursuing revenge. They were pursuing real estate. Not even Rome's most sacred religious offices offered protection from the prescriptions. Quintus Mucius Scaevola held the position of Pontifex Maximus, the highest religious office in all of Rome, a position considered untouchable even during the worst political violence in Roman history. He had opposed Sulla's return to power, aligning himself with the more moderate elements of the Marian faction. But Scaevola was an old man by this point, a respected legal scholar, not a soldier or a political schemer. When Sulla's forces came for him, Scaevola did something that, under any previous understanding of Roman religious law, should have guaranteed his absolute safety. He fled to the Temple of Vesta, the most sacred site in Rome, home to the eternal flame tended by the Vestal Virgins, a place so holy that even criminals fleeing justice had historically found sanctuary there. Scaevola threw himself against the sacred altar itself, physically clinging to it, invoking centuries of religious tradition that this ground was untouchable. His killers murdered him anyway. Right there, at the altar, with his hands still gripping the sacred stone. This single act sent a message that went beyond even the horror of the prescriptions themselves. If the high priest of Rome could be murdered while clinging to the most sacred altar in the city, then nothing, no tradition, no law, no religious protection, could shield anyone from Sulla's purge. Now here is a detail that connects this ancient horror directly to one of the most famous names in all of history. A young man, barely 18 years old at the time, found himself dangerously close to the prescription lists. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar's connection to the Marian faction ran deep. He had married Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, the very man who had ruled Rome alongside Marius during the years of terror before Sulla's return. When Sulla demanded that Caesar divorce Cornelia, as a public demonstration of loyalty to the new regime, Caesar refused. Think about what this meant. A teenager, with his entire family's safety hanging in the balance, looked at the most powerful and most dangerous man in Rome and said no. Sulla's response was immediate. Caesar's inheritance was confiscated, his wife's dowry was seized, and his name was added to the list of those marked for death. Caesar fled Rome, moving from hiding place to hiding place, reportedly suffering from malaria during part of his flight, constantly bribing soldiers sent to track him down in order to remain alive just one more night. It was only through the desperate intervention of Caesar's powerful relatives, many of whom had supported Sulla himself, that the dictator was eventually persuaded to spare the young man's life. But Sulla's reaction to sparing Caesar has been recorded by ancient historians, and it is one of history's most haunting examples of a powerful man recognizing a future threat and being unable or unwilling to act on his own instincts. According to Suetonius, Sulla reportedly told those who pleaded for Caesar's life that they were making a grave mistake. He said that hidden within this young man, there were many Mariuses. He saw it. He saw in an 18-year-old boy the seeds of exactly the kind of ambition and danger that had driven Rome to civil war in the first place, and he let him live anyway. Less than 4 decades later, that same Julius Caesar would cross his own forbidden boundary, the Rubicon River, leading his own army into Roman territory, beginning a new civil war, and eventually becoming dictator of Rome himself, in events that would directly echo and ultimately surpass everything Sulla had done. History does not often give us such a clear, documented thread connecting one catastrophe to the next, but here it does. The boy Sulla, almost killed, became the man who finished what Sulla's prescriptions had started, the complete destruction of the Roman Republic. So, how many people actually died during Sulla's prescriptions? This is a question that ancient historians themselves struggled to answer precisely, and modern historians continue to debate it today. The ancient historian Appian, writing roughly 2 centuries after the events, provides what is generally considered the most reliable surviving account. He records that more than 90 senators were killed, a staggering number, given that the entire Roman Senate at the time numbered only around 300 members. Appian also records that approximately 2,000 of the equites, the wealthy knightly class, the businessmen and landowners just below the senatorial rank, were proscribed and killed. Other ancient sources suggest the numbers may have been even higher. One ancient account claims the total death toll in Rome itself approached 3,000 people, when accounting for those killed without ever being formally added to a written list, victims of simple greed, mistaken identity, or personal vendettas carried out under the cover of legal chaos. And the violence did not remain confined to the city of Rome. Proscription lists were posted not just in the capital, but in cities and towns throughout Italy. Local feuds, personal grudges, and business rivalries were settled the same way, far from Sulla's direct oversight, using his proscription system as legal cover for what was, in many cases, simple murder. Modern historians estimate that when you account for the full scope of the killing, in Rome and throughout Italy, the documented and the undocumented, the true death toll likely exceeded several thousand people. But the precise number, even now, remains genuinely unknowable, because that uncertainty was, in many ways, the entire design of the system. A list that could always grow, a killing that could always be justified, a number that no one, not even the man who created it, ever truly tracked. By 81 before Christ, Sulla held a position that no Roman had held in over a century. He was named dictator for the reconstitution of the Republic, an office with no fixed term, no checks on his authority, and no real precedent in the history of Rome's constitution. He used this power to reshape Roman government completely. He weakened the office of the tribune, the position that had historically protected ordinary citizens from senatorial overreach. He strengthened the Senate itself, restoring much of its traditional authority. He created an entirely new legal framework intended, in his own stated belief, to make Rome more stable for generations to come. And then, in 79 before Christ, Sulla did something that genuinely shocked Rome, perhaps more than even the proscriptions themselves had. He resigned. The man who had marched an army into Rome, who had ordered the deaths of thousands of his fellow citizens, who held more absolute power than any Roman in living memory, voluntarily walked away from it. He retired to his country estate, reportedly to write his memoirs, and reportedly to live out his remaining years in considerable luxury, completely unpunished and unchallenged for everything he had done. He died in 78 before Christ, just a year after his resignation, from natural causes. Some ancient accounts describe a disturbing illness involving infestation by parasites, which several historians have interpreted as a kind of poetic justice, even if the details remain medically uncertain. His funeral, however, tells you everything you need to know about how Rome truly remembered him. It was a massive state funeral, attended by enormous crowds, with full military honors. The same Senate he had purged through mass murder now praised him publicly as the savior of the Republic. This is perhaps the most disturbing truth of this entire story. Sulla was never punished. He was never put on trial. He was never even seriously challenged for what he had done. He died wealthy, respected, and free, having personally ordered the deaths of thousands of Roman citizens, and having survived to write his own version of events for history to remember. Here is what most retellings of this story miss entirely. Sulla's proscriptions were not simply a horrific historical event, contained safely in the past. They were a working blueprint, a demonstration, proven and documented, that political violence in Rome could be organized, legalized, and survived without consequence. Less than 3 decades later, a different group of Roman leaders would look back at exactly what Sulla had done and decide to do it again, more efficiently. In 43 before Christ, 3 men, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, formed what historians now call the Second Triumvirate. And almost immediately, they revived Sulla's proscription system, posting new lists of enemies condemned to death without trial. Among the names on that second, deadlier list was one of Rome's most famous statesmen and orators, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero had spent his career studying men exactly like Sulla. He had written extensively about the dangers of unchecked political violence, and in the end, he died the exact same way as so many victims of the first proscriptions. Hunted down, executed without trial, his head and his hands displayed publicly in the Roman Forum as a warning to others. The lesson Rome's future leaders took from Sulla was not that this kind of violence was wrong. The lesson was that it worked. Modern historians studying the collapse of the Roman Republic consistently point to Sulla's proscriptions as a critical turning point. The moment when political murder stopped being an unthinkable taboo and became instead simply a tool of governance available to whoever held enough military power to use it. Within 50 years of Sulla's death, the Roman Republic itself would collapse entirely, replaced by the rule of emperors. Julius Caesar, Augustus, and the long line of rulers who followed all governed, in part, using lessons learned directly from Sulla's example. That absolute power, taken by force and justified after the fact, could be made to look, with enough time and enough propaganda, almost like stability. Before we close today, I want you to think about something. Every single person killed during Sulla's proscriptions had a name, a family, a home, a life that ended not because of a battle, not because of a crime, but because of a list, posted in a public square, paid for by greed, enforced by neighbors and slaves and sons, turned against the people who trusted them most. We remember Sulla's name today. We rarely remember theirs. The man whose villa killed him, the praetor whose currency reforms had once made him beloved by an entire city before his body was torn apart at a tomb, the high priest murdered while clutching the most sacred altar in Rome. History has a habit of remembering the men who hold the pen that writes the list, and forgetting almost everyone whose name was written on it. That is the story of the night Rome murdered its own people and called it justice. Before you go, this is your favorite part of every episode. Today, you learned 8 powerful English words. Let's review them now. The first word is proscription. A proscription is an official order condemning someone to death or banishment, often as part of a list. Sulla's proscriptions targeted thousands of Roman citizens by name. In a sentence, his name appeared on the proscription list, posted publicly in the Forum. The second word is bounty. A bounty is a reward of money offered for capturing or killing someone. Killers received a bounty of 2 talents for every proscribed man they found. In a sentence, the promise of a bounty turned neighbors and even family members into killers. The third word is ruthless. Ruthless means having no pity or compassion for others. Sulla's ruthless pursuit of his enemies left thousands dead within weeks. In a sentence, his ruthless ambition destroyed any sense of loyalty between Romans. The fourth word is sanctuary. A sanctuary is a sacred or protected place where someone is supposed to be safe. Even the sanctuary of the Temple of Vesta could not protect Scaevola from his killers. In a sentence, he sought sanctuary at the altar, but it offered him no protection. The fifth word is confiscate. To confiscate means to officially take someone's property away, usually as a punishment. The state would confiscate the property of every proscribed citizen. In a sentence, his farms and his home were confiscated the moment his name appeared on the list. The sixth word is dictator. A dictator is a ruler who holds total power, usually without the caramel checks of law or election. Sulla was named dictator for the reconstitution of the republic with no fixed term. In a sentence, as dictator, Sulla rewrote Roman law according to his own will. The seventh word is legacy. A legacy is the long-term effect or influence that a person or event leaves behind. Sulla's legacy taught future Roman leaders that political murder could go unpunished. In a sentence, the proscriptions left a dark legacy that shaped Roman politics for generations. The eighth word is complicit. Complicit means involved in a wrongdoing, even if you didn't commit the main act yourself. Ordinary citizens became complicit in murder simply by choosing silence over helping the condemned. In a sentence, anyone who turned away from a dying neighbor became complicit in the proscriptions. Proscription, bounty, ruthless, sanctuary, confiscate, dictator, legacy, complicit. 8 words that now live inside one of the darkest chapters of Roman history. That is the best way to learn language, not from a textbook, from history. Dark, real, unforgettable history. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who loves history. And come back next week, because the next story is even darker.